In this video, I'm going to go over how the FTP server is working. Basically, the goal of an FTP server is to follow the FTP protocol, and you can find the protocol on Google. But the main idea is it was created so that you could transfer files between computers, and you couldn't have a malicious person just uploading a million files to you and overloading your hard drive, basically. So one of the main keys is that every time someone uploads a file to your computer, they have to enter a username and a password. Of course, the way you implement your FTP server, you could just have not even check the password and just let whoever upload it. But in the case of us, we're only going to have one user and one password that should be able to get onto and upload files, so we could do it that way. So what's going to happen is the client is going to send their username and password. Well, first they're going to send a username, and then we're going to basically store that and wait for the next command from the same IP address, and they're going to send us their password. We're going to check their username and their password against what was stored already, and if it's actually the username's password, then we're going to let them continue. Otherwise, we're going to send them failure, and then they'll have to restart and send their username again and then another password again. So you can also do other commands like Linux commands, basically, where the user, after they enter their username and password, will start at a specific directory on the FTP server, and they can go into a different directory and look at the files in that directory and pull one if it wants, or send one to it if it wants. And that's all done using the CWD and all those kind of commands. But what we're really interested in is how do they actually send the zip files to us. And so the main command for that, there's going to be two of them. There's either passive or there's ePassive. And then also store. And I think that's it. So what the passive and ePassive commands are going to do is the client actually has to set up a connection where they're storing their file at that we can then connect to, and then they'll basically do the transaction on their end. So we do all the FTP communication over here, where they're telling us who they are and requesting files from us and telling us that they want to send us a file, but the actual file is transferred on their IP address. So they're going to send this ePassive command, which will tell us where to connect to, and then we'll connect to that, and then once we're connected, they'll send the file to us, and then we'll disconnect. But we'll still always be connected on the FTP server, so they can continue to do other commands while sending files, basically. So in this file, we've implemented all of these commands, and they're their own functions, and basically this FTP server runs on its own thread, so we can be doing other things in the Arena while this is running, constantly listening for people to connect to it and request files and send us files and all that kind of stuff. It's going to be on its own kind of program, although it's just a thread. So I won't bore you all with the details of how this FTP server is implementing each of these functions. I just kind of wanted to scroll through it so you can kind of get a good idea of how many functions you have to actually put into this so that it'll work as expected. So now that we have this, and then we go back to the main method and see kind of how we're using it. What happens is we set up our FTP server on an IP address, which will be our host address, which can be any of those IP addresses that this machine can connect to. That can either be localhost, it can be that router address that I was talking about in a previous video, it can be the IP address to the outside world, and it also has to specify a port. And since this is FTP, it's either going to be 20 or 21, and since we're passive mode FTP, we're going to be port 21. And then we specify a directory where we're going to save all our files at. We start the server, and then I wrote a test script to actually make sure that we're receiving the zip file and that everything's working, basically. So that test file I called FTP tester, and you can see we're implementing the commands here. So the first thing that the client's going to do is it's going to connect to our Arena host IP in port, which is done on this line is where it's creating the endpoint, and this line is where it's making a socket, which is an internet streamed, which is bytes, with protocol TCP, and it will create a endpoint for itself, which is where it's going to send the zip file at. Remember, I told you that the FTP server is going to connect to this address, and it's on the client's machine. So this would be basically the web server. Will tell us an IP address to connect to, where it'll send the zip file to us. So it binds to that address, so no one else can in that port, so no one else can take it. So the web server can't be hosting multiple things on the same port, so we need to basically reserve that port by binding it, and that's what this line is doing. And then it's basically connecting to the Arena right here, so it's taking that Arena endpoint we initialized earlier, and it's actually connecting to it. And as soon as it connects to it, it can get a response from the server saying, hey, and the server will basically say, hey, you're connected to me, we're good to go. And so then we send them the username, which I just said the username is guest for now. And then we sleep for 10 seconds to let the FTP server process what we just sent it, and then we read the response again, and it should be something like, hey, username, that's a good username, continue. And then we send the password command, which right now we're sending nothing as the password. And then we push that to the server. That's what flush is doing, is once you're actually writing it to the buffer, it's not actually pushing it to the web server until you hit flush. Okay, and then we wait another 10 milliseconds for processing that password command. And then we receive the response to say, hey, that password was good, or no, that password wasn't good. For now, we just assume the password is good, so we continue. We're not actually parsing the responses at all. We're just pretty much just writing them out to the console because I know this will work. So normally you would do, an if check to make sure that the response was a good response. So then we send this eport command. I guess it's I said epassive earlier, but I guess it's eport is the one that we're actually going to use. And so this tells the FTP server what the address is that it needs to connect to and what port to connect to, and that's all what this formatting is right here. So it's basically telling the FTP server, hey, I want to send you a zip file, and this is the address you connect to, so I can send it to you. And it pushes that, and then it waits for the FTP address to be ready to go, and then it reads the response to make sure the Arena said, okay, sure, I'll connect to that port. And then we send it what type of file we're sending it. You can send either a text file, or you can send a byte file, and I guess that's just for the FTP server to parse it. So I guess you can basically, a text file doesn't necessarily have to be rendered as bytes. It could just be text, whereas the image files and video files should always be bytes because you can't read them in as text, basically. So you say type I, which means, okay, read this as bytes, and we wait for the FTP server to process that, read its response, and then we send the store command, and the store command is going to tell the FTP server what the file name is. So we send store, and then whatever we want to call the file. Right now I have it saved as myzip.zip, and it flushes that, tells the server again, and then it will listen, that's what this line is, for the Arena to connect to it. So it'll let 2 connections happen, but you really only need 1, and that'll be the Arena connecting to the port where we're sending the zip file. And it'll be listening, and then as soon as the Arena connects, we can accept it, and we store what address the Arena is at. We should probably already know it, but this is a good way to make sure that you're communicating on the same IP by accepting it, and then reading what client you accepted. And then we wait a little bit longer, and then this is where we're actually sending the file. So it's calling this function send variable data, and the reason why it's a separate file is when you're sending byte data over the internet, you need to send it in packets. So you can't just send all 10 gigabytes of a file at one time. You break it up into chunks so that if one part of it doesn't make it, it can re-request that small little packet and not have to start all the way over at that with that big file all at one time. It also, if you sent a whole big file like that, it would eat up all the bandwidth of your internet. So that's why you send things in small packets. Okay, and once we've sent the file, we don't need to use the connection any longer, so we shut it down and we close it. Okay, and then we wait for the server to do its processing, and then we read its response, and it should say, hey, that went fine, and then we quit, which quit command just basically closes the connection to the FTP server. And we read the Arena's response. And that's basically it. I have a try catch in here in case we were not able to connect to it. It'll print out the error that we got. And then this is just the function I mentioned earlier where we're breaking it into smaller packets. And so we send the data until there's none left. So now we can see it in action. We go, so we start with nothing in the Arenas folder, and then we hit play. And now every 10 seconds, it's going to send the file, and it'll update the timestamp when it re-uploads it to the server's kind of